Marwan, I'm happy to see you, and hope that we will have a fruitful conversation today, focused on reform efforts, focused on governance issues, and how they change our environment, how they change our also the international scene. We have spoken a lot of times with the on the Aspen Ministers Forum with the whole group, that the international institutions are created a long time ago, and they need a little bit of refurbishing, as Secretary Albright likes to say. The question of future reform, not only of the international institutions, but of our own political environment, stands always as a permanent question in front of us, especially in these uneasy times. You were part at the time of a large reform effort, and I'd be very happy to hear how exactly did you assess that experience, what worked, what didn't, and what were the setbacks potentially out of the whole effort.
It's great to see you too, Daniel. I was foreign minister for 3 years in Jordan, 2002 to 2004. At the end of that year, 2004, the king asked me to head an inclusive national committee to come up with a political, economic, and social blueprint for reform. The committee came up with the idea that you cannot do economic reform without having political reform in parallel. That is, if you want to ask people to move from basically what was a welfare state to a self-reliant economy, you cannot do that without also having them have a buy-in in the system, and therefore have them feel they are part of the decision-making process. We actually had a lot of opposition, not from the usual sort of forces opposed to the system in Jordan, but from the forces loyal to the system, who did not want to give up their privileges. Interestingly, this happened in 2005, so 6 years before the Arab Spring took place. Then 6 years later, of course, as conditions did not improve, and as the status quo forces kept their grip on the system, not just in Jordan, but in many countries around the Arab world, people were basically saying no to authoritarian rule and took to the streets in 2011.
I will share a little bit more of an experience from Eastern Europe when it comes to the fact that people need to be involved in the reform, and they need to be ready. They need to share the final goals of the reform, indeed. But also you said something, according to me, important, which could be extrapolated on international level, which is basically the idea which reigned in the beginning of the 90s, the paradigm that if we open up the markets and we allow the free flow of capital and goods, with the free market, certain type of values will travel to countries which are not fully reformed in a democratic manner, and little by little the people will start pressuring their autocratic or authoritarian governments in order to start a change. That didn't happen, and we basically observed the results of the wrongfulness of that paradigm. It's always important to know who does the reform and what kind of reform, because no one guarantees that reform is necessarily a thing which moves the society forward. Regress in societies is observed constantly, even now. And when I mention reform, when I speak about reform, I have in mind democratic reforms aimed at guaranteeing the fundamental principles we all know: the separation of powers, rule of law, freedom of expression, economic freedoms, basic human rights, transparency and accountability, free and fair elections, political pluralism, and so on. Very often, as we see, the temptation to go back to some supposedly wonderful past times is grasping the hearts of the majority of a nation. and we are witnessing this constantly.
I also want Daniel to talk about an issue that you touched upon also, which is who starts the reform process. You know, who really, what are the first steps to be taken? Is it the rule of law? Is it? I think here the importance of new social contracts is I cannot, you know, overestimate the importance of social contracts. What we have seen in the region is that reform from above is not working. You know, governments, basically systems, are not interested in reform from above, and frankly, there are very few examples around the world where reform from above works. But the other problem is that reform from below is also equally difficult. People can easily start protests, but to transform protests into institution building is a totally different manner. And what we have seen in the Arab world mainly is that, you know, people went to the street in 2011 because of the lack of good governance, but they were not able to transform their protests into proper institution building, except in one country, and that is Tunisia. And why did they did it in Tunisia differently than in other countries? Because the first order of business they did was saying, you know what, we need a new social contract, not one that is imposed upon us by governments, but one that is negotiated amongst ourselves. And for 3 years, they negotiated this new social contract, which basically established the rules of the game.
If the majority of the society does not understand what reforms exactly are proposed and how exactly they're going to be implemented, they're going to be lost in them. But in the meantime, autocrats, they use this narrative by saying our society needs an autocrat because the people are not ready, because we're still not mature for certain type of processes and democracies. So hence, me, the autocrat, I'm going to prepare them. And they usually prepare the society for 50 years, then comes another autocrat. So basically, what we know is that we need leadership who has the will to perpetually introduce reform and look for consensus within the society and lead towards certain changes, but not by imposition, but by education and involvement of all levels of society into the reform process. The problem of Eastern Europe was that we rushed into imitation. We started imitating norms and institutions, but to a great extent, the society was not even culturally ready to start behaving in accordance with those norms. We saw the product of the Western civilization and we said, give it to us. The wealth, the way of life, if you will, the iPhones or whatever was there modern in the beginning of the 90s, but there was no education for anyone to how to apply these norms in everyone's individual life. There was no civic education involved. Reforms can be effective when the majority of the population understands them and is ready to implement them on individual level.
The trust gap, and I don't know whether that's true in Eastern Europe or Bulgaria, but the trust gap between citizens and their governments and parliaments and all institutions in our region is amazingly wide. It's almost, if the government says the sun, you know, comes out from the east, they will say no. There's no trust in anything that the government does. And so, you know, Lebanon is another example. Lebanon has been, you know, people have been on the street for a year now, protesting the corrupt practices of their leaders. But for a whole year, they have not been able to even name an alternative. They keep rejecting the alternatives that are being put forward, justifiably. But they are not able to present a framework, a set of names in order to move forward. And that's the dilemma that I feel at least my region is going to be in for a while. We are better able at saying no than we are able at saying yes to something.
The formation of this distrust you're talking about is not necessarily bad. Modern democracies are based on this mistrust. That is why we build all the checks and balances, all the separation of powers, all the mechanisms of transparency and accountability, just in order to keep those who we have elected temporarily to govern us, to keep them in check. And I believe that is actually a good quality for the new generations not to trust. All that energy needs to be channeled towards the creation and crafting of institutions which will manage that distrust. So to me, that's a very positive thing, actually.
When you look at your region and the future of it, what gives you hope that things will change in the positive direction? Or I can also ask, what keeps you up at night, fearing that the reverse might take place?
What gives me hope? I believe after each storm comes a time when everyone realizes that we cannot go back to the caves. We cannot go back to previous times, which might have been nice for some people, but those times are gone. We are in a Gutenberg moment. What I mean is that the social media advancements and development basically acts as an agent of such change, which Gutenberg at the time brought with the invention of the printing press. Nowadays, everyone has a megaphone. Anyone can say anything, and the monopoly over information is already gone. That destroys authority, but also creates and empowers people. So what gives me hope is that the people here, especially in my country or in Eastern Europe as a whole, the new generations you were referring to are the ones who know, who have seen how well-developed democracies work. They know, they have traveled, they have worked, they have studied abroad. And now they're the ones taking on the streets and demanding certain type of change. So these new generations, I believe I'm part of that, even if with a little bit of a little bit older than the really new generations. But I believe that
you're still very young, Daniel.
Well, don't ask me how I feel. So, and what is your where lies your optimism?
I'm equally optimistic about the young generation for the very reasons that you just mentioned, Daniel, and that's a sign of the times. Whether you're in East Europe or whether you're in the Middle East, you're connected to the whole world. So this is a new generation that is less attached to sort of old, narrow nationalistic views of the world, and feel that the whole world is their domain. So I am optimistic. I think this region is undergoing a huge transformation politically as well as economically. The Arab world has and is finding itself today in a situation that has been compounded by COVID-19, where the political order, is crumbling, the economic order is crumbling, but there's still a lot of resistance to move to a more inclusive and productive system, politically and economically. The old guard in the Arab world is still clinging to their power, refusing to realize that the order has died and that they do not have the tools that they used to do to perpetuate that old order. And this is what we are finding themselves in. It's an interim period where the old has died and the new is not able to be born. Now, are governments able to internalize this, what is seemingly obvious conclusion that they need to adopt more inclusive policies from now on because the old era is over? I'm not so sure. In fact, I'm not optimistic about that. I have a lot of faith in this new generation, as I see that you do. And like you, I think that just, people cannot turn the clock back. After each calamity, there has to be movements that will look forward.
That is absolutely correct. So Marwan, it was wonderful seeing you and having such a pleasant and I believe informative conversation. And I'm looking forward to seeing each other very, very soon.
It was a pleasure for me too, and I really look forward to meeting, hopefully physically, sometime soon.